Welcome to this recording of the Activist Lawyer podcast, brought to you from the Granite Podcast Studio in the heart of Newry City. We are delighted that you could join us at Activist Lawyer, where we will be discussing a range of topical matters engaging not only with lawyers, but people who are committed to highlighting and combating injustices and inequalities. We will bring you our thoughts, but invite you to share yours. We'll be looking for contributors to our blog at activistlawyer.com, as we want your perspective as we unravel and unpack a host of issues. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm a solicitor practising in Newry City. I worked with a human rights firm in Dublin for many years and with a number of rights-based organisations and charities. I'm looking forward to meeting some fantastic guests throughout this series. Hello listeners, thank you for joining us today. I'm with Jack.
Hello.
Hi Jack. Today in the studio, and we're actually very excited about the guests that we have joining us in this recording today, and I hope you all take something away with it. We're actually joined by Professor Colin Harvey, and Jack and I are very familiar with Colin's work, not just in terms of the immigration work that we do and his discussions on citizens' rights and Brexit, etc., but he's been very prominent when it comes to talking about the concept of New Ireland and this new vision of a shared island and unity. Now, we have had some of our guests on touching on that issue, but Colin really takes us in depth into
expert in the field.
His vision, his opinion, and really the legal stance as well upon which all of this rests. And I think it's just such a fascinating discussion. We could have gone on for a long time. So just to introduce listeners to Colin who aren't familiar with him, Colin Harvey is a professor of human rights law in the School of Law at Queen's University, Belfast. He is a fellow of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice, and an Associate Fellow of the Institute of Irish Studies. He is a member of the Management Board of Ireland's Future. And again, we're very thankful for Colin joining us today. Jack, you took a lot away.
Oh, it was a great discussion. I know Colin had taught me last year and it was great to hear him speak again, especially about this issue about Irish unity.
Absolutely. So again, what's great about today's show, we actually had contributions from students who presented some questions to Colin. So it's really, really interesting and we hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Professor Colin Harvey, to today's episode. Colin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. Delighted to be with you for this conversation.
Firstly, we'll just briefly chat about your work, and I think Jack and I had attended a number of events recently that you were at. Well, actually, one of them was 2 years ago. It doesn't seem like that. The Waterfront Belfast, and in the Canal Court as well. And you were part of a panel talking about the idea of a new vision for Ireland. And if I remember, it was a very kind of diverse panel there, both in the Canal Court and the Waterfront. So that really started our interest in pursuing, not pursuing this matter, but following it. And it was before Jack even worked with me. So yeah, it kind of brought us together.
I know, first time we met.
So I think this interview, even more so now, is quite timely given the current situation we're in Northern Ireland in particular. You know, we're in a post-Brexit society in the midst of a global pandemic. There's a debate around citizens' rights growing. We've experienced that in terms of the immigration side of things. Discussions around identity is very, very prominent, especially among younger people. The protocol, recent street violence and disturbances across NI, which we covered on this programme, and very much back on the table is the topic of Irish unity. So Colin is going to provide us with his insight and experience and opinion regarding primarily the latter of those issues. So we'll get stuck in. I think we'll start with what we all remember, which was the Brexit referendum result being announced a number of years back. But 5 years on, I think it's fair to say the momentum around a discussion about Irish unity is rapidly growing. I hear it on the radio. We've read so much about it as well in recent press. So just on that point, Colin, do you think that Brexit was always going to raise the issue of Irish unity, or how would it impact that, given that I suppose what we see in Scotland, like Northern Ireland voters wanted to remain in the EU? Was this debate inevitable, I guess, from the moment the UK withdrew from the EU, or that fact became apparent?
Well, first of all, Sarah and Jack, just like to say that delighted to be invited to speak to you on this topic, and it's great to have a chance to discuss with you. And I think yes is the answer to your question. I think it's inevitable if you think about it. Northern Ireland was removed from the European Union against the will of its people. And, in the absence of consent, with one part of the island being in the EU and one part being out, it seems to me that it would be odd if we weren't having this conversation, because, what has changed as a result of Brexit is that European Council has made clear, April 2017, we have an automatic return option to the European Union. So in fact, I would almost turn the question round and say it would be odd, strange, if people weren't contemplating what is a core dimension of the Good Friday Agreement at this time.
And just on that, the legal mechanisms that might perhaps ground and establish these discussions, we don't really go into that, but I was looking at some of your literature and pieces you published, and you do go into great detail. Just for our listeners, can you explain that a little bit more, Colin?
No problem at all. I think one of the reassuring things about the debate here is that this is all essentially part of the agreement. So the starting point is essentially the Good Friday Agreement in the constitutional issues section there, where the self-determination mechanism is set out in quite a bit of detail, linked, of course, to the principle of consent. So essentially, we already have an established pathway constitutionally to address this issue. It's in a multi-party agreement, the agreement, bilateral, international legal agreement as well, and it's reflected in the domestic constitutional legal arrangements of both the UK and Ireland. So I suppose the starting point would be that the way forward for this debate is well established. It's not stepping outside of the norm to have this conversation. And so in a sense, it's about implementing, discussing provisions that are already agreed and endorsed across this island that are there in the Good Friday Agreement. So I think that's an important starting point for your listeners. No one should be worried about engaging in something that is really at the heart, constitutional heart of the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah, and I think that's important to remember. I mean, the discussion on this isn't just emanating from nowhere. It's there, and and some people may not be aware of that fact. And it's only through reading through certain documents over the past few years I got to grips with how that was provided for under the principle of self-determination and consent, as you mentioned. Just another, I've been looking at some of your publications as well, and you commented that the nature of the question of unity is not a separate or a detached issue. It is central for everyone considering the future. If the UK can decide to leave the EU, then it seems reasonable to allow the people here the option of responding in kind by waving goodbye to the UK. This does seem reasonable, particularly given the fact that the Good Friday Agreement, as you mentioned, provides a mechanism as such to exercise the rights we spoke about, and for Northern Ireland to perhaps stay in the EU. But it's Northern Ireland, and there's always a discomfort, a level of discomfort around the notion of even discussing the issue of Irish unity. Do you sense this when you speak with people about the issue, and what's your experience of that?
Well, I think, first of all, really and Sarah, you raise a good point about the issue of awareness, because, knowledge of the agreement, makes clear that, the constitutional status of Northern Ireland rests on consent.
Yes.
And I think that's often spoken about, but sometimes people don't follow through in terms of what it actually means. But I think what's been interesting to me is that there's a growing civic and political appetite to have the conversation. Like, Sarah, you'll know that you can hardly pick up a newspaper these days or turn on the radio without a discussion. There's, university initiatives that are exploring all the sort of boring detail around, technical detail around how you do the referendum and what happens afterwards. There's civic initiatives. I'm involved myself in the work of Ireland's Future.
Yes.
And so, there's podcasts, there's commentators, almost every commentator across these islands has had something to say about this issue in the last number of years. So, I detect a growing appetite, and just really to underline what I said at the start, that seems absolutely reasonable to me, because it would be odd after Brexit if people weren't talking about it. So it's really, really heartening to me to see it becoming a more, mainstream conversation. I suppose the final point would be, a lot of the discussion has also been really, really quite responsible. The language of the debate is the language of planning and preparing for potential change. And I think that seems to me to be the smart, sensible thing to do.
Jack, you and I were actually talking about the language during this funny.
So in previous podcasts, we've spoke about the importance of language and how we frame things. So, and our use of language is always very important. But how can we make the language around unity and a united Ireland and a shared Ireland more inclusive, particularly as it relates to Northern Ireland, Colin?
It's a great question, Jack. Starting point again is that people becoming more aware of what the Good Friday Agreement says and requires. And I think in framing this discussion, it's useful to go back to the values of the agreement. And we've talked about the constitutional issues section, but I think it's also worth looking again at the declaration of support at the start of the agreement and the sort of inclusive language there around mutual respect, equality of treatment, parity of esteem, and the importance of human rights in framing the discussion. Also clear that, a lot of the language around this is around not simply a united Ireland, but a new Ireland. And I think what that shows to me is that people want to see a bit of imagination and creativity around the conversation. They're a bit fed up with the last number of decades, perhaps more, and they want to see something new and different on the table. I think also myself, I find the language of shared island or shared Ireland, I find that language helpful because, we're talking about how we share the island in the here and now, but we're also thinking about how we might share it in the future. I think that more inclusive language is helpful in perhaps bringing more people into the room or into the virtual room to feel a bit more comfortable, to open up around not just how we share things on the island now, but how we share them in the future. And, ultimately that's what a new Ireland, a united Ireland will be. It will simply be a different way of sharing the island in the decades ahead. And that hopefully opens up a bit of space for the sort of imagination and creativity we're talking about. Now, I don't think it's not a blank page conversation because it'll be shaped by the agreement. But I think you're right. The language that we use is important. But also, I think we have to acknowledge and be honest with people that the language of the agreement will very much frame the conversation.
Absolutely. And I think it's really, it really strikes me, and it's just on a personal level, speaking with other people and family members I know, and they seem to be much more pulled into the conversation when you refer to it in those terms. And I don't think it's just blanketing over thing. I think this is our reality. And I think, we take some kind of examples from people like Emma D'Souza, who talks about Northern Ireland is no longer, belonging to a green community and an orange community. It's very much, especially among younger people who don't identify with either of those kind of party lines and traditional ways of thinking, but they have a new vision themselves, and they have been very much part of this conversation and taken that forward. And I don't know, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but we had Reverend Karen Sethuraman on the podcast, Colin, a few weeks back, and she spoke about this concept of neighbours and working towards something, inclusive through a wider citizens' debate or a citizens' assembly. So I guess how, in practical terms, do we define this vision and maybe appeal to those across Ireland, north and south, when we're presenting this vision, for example?
Yeah, I know Emma and Karen and very much agree with the idea that many people are entering this debate with the language of a new Ireland because they're, frankly fed up with what passes for a discussion in the north of the island particularly, but across the island. So they genuinely are engaging because they want to see something new emerge. And also many people feel very uncomfortable with some of the existing labels here. Just to give you the idea, many people involved in the debate around a new Ireland don't find the label nationalist, right, particularly helpful way of describing themselves. Because, if you're somebody like me who's been involved in working on human rights, equality, working for the rights of refugees and asylum seekers, that's a million miles away from narrow nationalism. No, but to still have a view about a new Ireland. I think ultimately it's a fascinating debate that many people are involved in because they want something transformative.
Yes.
They don't just want a tweak of the status quo north and south. They're involved in the conversation because they want it to be transformational in equality and human rights terms.
Absolutely.
The recognition, that what's happened north and south has been appalling in terms of equality and human rights guarantees over the last 100 years. And I suppose ultimately in that, Karen's reference to the importance of citizens' engagement, that this shouldn't be a top-down discussion, although the governments will be central to it. They want to hear what people across the island have to say. So people's engagement, citizens' engagement, north and south, in shaping the debate, in shaping the new arrangements is absolutely vital, and I think they're right on that.
They're right, and you can see that shift already. I mean, especially if you look to the south over the past 5 to 6 years, around the referendums that they had, and really a move towards a more modern Ireland, very much built on the back of the kind of younger generation and building that Ireland for them. I myself was involved in some of the discussions leading up to repeal, and you could repeal the 8th, which was a referendum in the south, and the Citizens' Assembly and that referendum, and you could just really sense people were, no matter what their views were, people wanted to be involved and they wanted the questions to be put to them. And there were difficult questions. They weren't easy. And I remember sitting in the room at round table events and people feeling uncomfortable. But by the end of it, everybody was happy to have shared their view and had been listened to. So that was very effective. And do you think on that point, is there something we can organise on a formal footing that would reflect that level of, I suppose, engagement among citizens across the island on this matter?
Well, I think, again, you're absolutely right to point to the way in which citizens' assemblies have already been used very, very successfully. And also, I think for me, that the vitally important role of activists and advocates, north and south, in really wanting to see something different and change. And I think they'll be central to this discussion too. People are calling for an all-island citizens' assembly or an all-island people's assembly in order to take forward this debate. And I think that's right. Starting point. That's not to discount the role of governments. That's not to discount the role of the Oireachtas in the Assembly and other bodies. But I think a sort of people-led, citizens-led engagement through an all-island citizens' assembly would be a great addition. And also, I think, encouraging that sort of activist momentum that has really, as you know, that's what's been leading change on the island in the last number of years. To capture that behind a sort of vision of how we could do better. People are thinking about the last 100 years, but, how are we going to do better in the next 100 years? What can we learn? What lessons can we learn? And I think, I would like to see civil society leading that discussion, but also we have to acknowledge, and this is worries me, people are sometimes afraid or they're shy or they're nervous or anxious about entering the public domain in this debate. And really what, myself personally, I've hoped to do is by stepping into the public sphere in these conversations is encouraging other people to take that step as well.
And I expect that's not always easy to do so. I mean, that level of citizens' engagement for me is also important to dispel myths, I guess, but also to move away from traditional rhetoric. And it's just because I've been a commuter and a cross-border worker for many, many years. I've had the experience of both, and obviously back living in the lovely city of Newry. I would have had friends, of course, in the south and people I worked with, and it was quite hostile at times. And I know a lot of people have experienced this. A lot of pushback, especially when Brexit happened. And I heard comments from very close friends around, well, don't be expecting you'll be coming down here. And it was quite common. And we had this discussion with another person on Twitter recently. But I think the only way to get over that and to really drill down and have people open up and kind of, be part of this shared vision, even the discussion leading to it, is to have that level of engagement. But What's your opinion on that, I suppose, in terms of people in the South, their perceptions, I guess, about Northern Ireland, and how do we get over that, and how do we bring them on board into the discussion as well, young and old, people from all backgrounds?
Well, I'd start by saying you're absolutely right. This requires concurrent consent, North and South. So there'll be a vote in the South as well.
Yes.
And there's a real risk that the South will be taken for granted in that debate. And I think that would be a monumental mistake to do that. Ultimately what we're talking about is unleashing the potential ultimately of the island, North and South, and that will be beneficial, not just for people in the North, but for people in the South as well, who are in some senses being held back by the division on this island as well. Ultimately, what's really, really encouraged me in the last while, people like Neil Richmond, you'll have seen recently, Fine Gael TD, entering the public debate with proposals, Jim O'Callaghan, Fianna Fáil, also entering the debate with proposals. And it's been interesting to watch them, articulate a vision that says ultimately this is about realising the potential of the island, not taking the southern electorate for granted, but that this can be a really quite exciting and also potentially transformative discussion for both bits of the island, in which ultimately what you're saying to people is we'd be better off that the current arrangements aren't working and that we could do a lot better without this division that we have on the island. But you're right, that will need to be sold to southern electorate, and there can be no complacency around that.
Yeah, and Colin, you're speaking there about people being involved in the debate and starting to discuss a United Ireland or shared island. And me and Sarah have heard from a number of commentators refer to a new Northern Ireland as an alternative to a United Ireland or shared Ireland. Is that something that you've considered in your research and your opinion?
Well, one of the things, Jack, it's an important point, is that there'll be a conversation here about change, if you like, in terms of Irish unity, but also the maintenance of the status quo. And I suppose one of the underexplored issues that you're highlighting there, I think, is the issue is what are those who are arguing for maintenance of the status quo going to argue? And I think one of the underexplored issues is, will there be a proposition that emerges for maintaining the union with Britain, but very much in the context, as you described there, of a new Northern Ireland within that framework? So what ultimately people like myself has been saying is that not just on the United Ireland side or New Ireland side, but those who are arguing for the maintenance of the status quo, what is their proposition going to be? Are they going to be proposing the same old Northern Ireland for the next 100 years? Or are they going to be suggesting some alternative proposals around how we share this space in Northern Ireland? And I've perhaps naively thought that we'd be better off for having this conversation of actually requiring people to try and persuade us, of the merits of their competing visions. So, there are people at the moment, there's organisations talking about making Northern Ireland work, as a way of framing that debate. So personally, I want to hear more about that. What does that mean? What does that look like? Does that embrace an inclusive vision of equality and human rights for everyone here? So to me, it's bring it on, let's have the conversation on all sides.
That's so true. I suppose the only context I've seen that in, Jack, the question you've just raised there about New Northern Ireland is people focusing on the issues that are ongoing here, the legacy issues, the violence and everything that's still kind of unresolved, I suppose. Aside from having the Good Friday Agreement in place, many communities are still suffering, poverty, social housing. But I suppose you're right. I mean, there needs to be another proposal as to how to make that work. And I have to admit, it's not something I've really seen a huge amount of talk about. I've just seen it pop up here and there. But I suppose it's interesting to see that perspective too. But when we think about as well, you mentioned at the start, Colin, about the coverage that this is receiving at the minute. And having lived in this, I'm surprised by it too. I have never seen such, there's political broadcasting about it north and south all the time. I'm just referring to, you might have seen the RTE debate as well in the Claire Byrne show.
Yeah, absolutely.
What was that, a few months, maybe a month or two ago? and they discussed the referendum on unity, and there were a range of voices represented there. I think there was quite a, it was made up of very, very different parties politically and backgrounds and journalists, etc. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were there, and of course Sinn Fein representing their stance in the matter from the south and their perspective. But it seemed to be this issue of a date cropped up a number of times, and the mainstream parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, have in recent times, you've mentioned there, a few candidates had, or a few representatives voiced their commitment to United Ireland. But whenever the proposal about a date or the suggestion of a date to firm this up and to, put a real date in it so we could work towards it, people didn't want to discuss that, it seemed. And I think in hearing you speak, you did have a date in mind for a referendum. What is the story? Is it still that date, or do you think that is no longer a realistic proposal?
Well, again, it's a fantastic question. My view on this is that you need a time frame for the conversation, that no successful planning project ever goes forward without some at least notion of what the time frame is. And I think there are too many people on this island that would simply procrastinate for the next 100 years if given half a choice, around it. So I think that we need some kind of notion of when this might happen, although very much bearing in mind the way in which the agreement is set up in relation to the conditions that trigger this. Like I did in 2019, just to give you context, I think it was around the middle of 2019, which is nearly 2 years ago, I proposed the 22nd of May 2023
that's right.
as a date for concurrent referendums on the island. And I'll just explain why I did that. First of all, I wanted to make a very direct link to the Good Friday Agreement. That's the 25th anniversary of the concurrent votes on the Good Friday Agreement that were held 22nd of May 1998. So I wanted to be clear about that. I wanted a link to the 25th anniversary of the agreement. And the rationale was simply to focus minds. I had planned to make that agreement link. I had been to too many meetings, Sarah, where people stand up and speak in the abstract about wanting this or wanting that or wanting a new Ireland or wanting a united Ireland. And then they left the room and did absolutely nothing about it. And it seemed to me that in the context of Brexit, it's absolutely legitimate for people to want to be given a choice. Ultimately, this right belongs to the people of this island, and north and south. It doesn't belong to Micheál Martin. It doesn't belong to Brandon Lewis. It doesn't belong to political parties. It belongs to the people. And why should people be continued to be denied that choice when it gives them an automatic return to the EU option? You try telling people in Scotland that we have an automatic return option to the EU,
which they don't.
I think absolutely. So, but what's been very reassuring, obviously we're now 2 years down the line nearly, and not much has happened. So 2023 is a bit optimistic, but it's very notable. You may have noticed that Bertie Ahern has suggested the 30th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in 2028.
Oh, I missed that.
And I don't know what the connection is there between. So I've 25th, he's 30th anniversary. But what's noticeable, Sarah, on that programme as well, is that a lot of people on the Claire Byrne programme and elsewhere have been using this language of the next decade. And the decade ahead becoming absolutely key. And I think that's right. But my view is we need some kind of notion of a time frame to do the sort of planning work. But ultimately, just want to end answering this question by being clear. My focus is on advanced planning and preparation, of doing the homework first, of not stumbling into referendums unprepared, of not repeating the Brexit disaster on the other island with implications for this island. We need to get this right, do the work first. And ultimately, what I've been doing over the last few years and my interventions have been trying to encourage political parties and civil society, wherever you stand on the argument, to begin to do that preparatory work so as we know what we're voting for when we come to vote in these concurrent referendums over the course of the next decade.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important. We need planning and we need action. around that to avoid that disaster of Brexit. But Jack, you were looking at some of we've a few starts when it comes to polling. I know polling's happened for years around this issue. I mean, it's not a novel concept, but the recent polls are interesting. I think, Jack, you've some of the figures there just for listeners.
Yeah, so Colin, we just wanted to get your opinion just on you've probably seen them, the BBC Spotlight polls that came out this month regarding questions around should Northern Ireland stay in the UK. Obviously, for the listeners who maybe haven't seen the statistics that came out, those who were asked whether Northern Ireland should stay in the UK, 49% said that they would like Northern Ireland to remain in the UK, with 43% saying they'd like to see them leave the UK. And then the same question that was asked for those under 45, it shifted a wee bit to 50% would favour a united Ireland and 43% would favour remain in the UK. So on the back of those statistics, Colin, what would your view be on those statistics specifically, especially without a specific plan or research in place?
Well, again, it's just to underline the point that my view is that underpinned by the closeness of some of those statistics and some of the information that's emerging around younger generations, is that we're on a clear trajectory towards these referendums happening over the course of the next decade, in my view. I think the statistics, the evidence underlines that that's the direction of travel in the time ahead. Now, the outcome of those referendums remains an open question. I don't think anything is inevitable, right? So I don't necessarily agree with people who say, Irish unity is inevitable. I don't think it is. Yeah. But I think we're rapidly approaching the point when the Secretary of State will be in a position where he either must do this or where he will do this, Yeah. And so I think it seems sensible to me to get ready. What's striking in those figures is, if you think about it, if you lived, in a jurisdiction where 43% of the population would leave, or would enter a new arrangement today, that's really, really striking.
It is.
It struck me thinking back to the Scottish independence referendum, the percentage points that the SNP put on as that campaign accelerated, So I think, for both sides in this, it's all to play for. But ultimately, what I want, like yourselves, is I want to hear the arguments, I want to hear what's a new Ireland, what's a united Ireland going to look like? If we stay in the UK, well, what does that look like? I want to hear what those arguments are. I want to see a bit of substance first before we're asked.
Absolutely. I think that's crucial, and that's how we bring people into the conversation, I guess. And that's the big questions people will be answering. Well, this podcast, we have a lot of listeners and students as well who've been engaging with us, and young aspiring lawyers. So Jack was actually able to get a couple of questions, Colin, I hope you don't mind answering, from students who submitted it into the show. So Jack might take us through a couple of those. We had quite a few. You've selected a few.
Yeah, selected maybe three. If we can get through those, we can maybe call this the student section or something. But the first question is, again, it's all around this area, but the student was asking, so the Office of Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has repeatedly refused to provide clarity on the criteria required for triggering a border poll. There's been no fewer than 12 Secretary of State since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, and none have considered a border poll. Do you believe, Colin, that this reflects the position of the current Conservative government or a policy specifically towards this region?
Well, again, it's a good question. My view is successive governments have failed to give us transparency and clarity around these provisions of the agreement in the Northern Ireland Act. You would almost think from what has happened that this element of the Good Friday Agreement is not really being taken sufficiently seriously until now. In a post-Brexit context, some of the hard thinking is only starting to be done. Your listeners may be aware that I have written repeatedly to the Secretary of State since December, 3 times now. I've got 3 responses from the Northern Ireland office. Yeah. Now, I'm very aware of the judgment of the Court of Appeal in the McCord case. Yeah. I'm very aware of the flexibility that the Secretary of State has around triggering this process. But I still think, in my view, that although he's not legally compelled to provide us with, his policy in this area, he could answer some basic questions around the evidence that he's using, how often he reviews that evidence, who he consults with, what the decision-making process is. Because ultimately, you've got something that could have a really dramatic impact on this island, being triggered by the Secretary of State, the British government, if you like, on which there's still insufficient clarity and certainty and transparency. And I know, people will say, well, there's been the Court of Appeal judgment, they have this flexibility. But I think he mightn't be legally compelled to tell us, but as a matter of basic political courtesy, if you like, I think it would be very, very helpful if Brandon Lewis would spell out in a bit more detail the sort of evidence he's relying on to make this assessment.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And we had Kieran O'Hara actually on this show representing the McCord case as well, talk about that. So
yeah.
And then obviously that's looking towards Northern Ireland. We'll just have a wee look at the Republic. As we've seen a recent electoral rise of Sinn Fein in the south, as real contenders for getting into the southern government. Has this inhibited the current Irish government from making steps towards preparing for unity, given that they appear, in opinion of the student, at all costs to have abandoned their efforts as co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement? Is it due to fear that if Sinn Féin gain access to the government in the south, that they'll hold positions of power in both the Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland?
Well, again, it's a good question. I suppose your last point frames the discussion. Sinn Féin are a party of government in the north, and they're the main opposition party in the south. Mm-hmm. It's no secret that they're a political party that has Irish unity as a core policy objective, and there's at least a reasonable likelihood that they may well be part of a future Irish government.
Yeah.
My view on that is, although we've talked about Brandon Lewis and Secretary of State and his role in all this, I think ultimately it will be when the Irish government decides now is the time to take this forward, when pressure starts to come from Dublin, if you like, on the British government to move, that we'll see real, genuine progress around this. And obviously then Sinn Féin, because it's so central to their sort of policy agenda, if they're in government in the south, I suspect one of the first agenda items with the British government will be precisely this. So I think it's obviously had an impact. Yeah. It's had an impact, I think, on the other parties as well. The shared island unit has been established, and I know that Micheál Martin is rather anxious and shy about referring to the unity question, but I think you have to see that in the light of this growing conversation. There's no way that shared island unit would have been created without the sort of momentum that's been building around this discussion as well. And, I think it's part of a wider agenda of planning for the future, whatever language you want to use. I've been in discussions with people around the work of that unit, and almost everybody in the room thinks you're talking about the United Ireland debate, even though you're in a room talking about a shared island. But maybe just to end as well, we've talked about Neil Richmond and Jim O'Callaghan. Neil Richmond and Jim O'Callaghan have put down on paper very, very detailed proposals, on the way forward. And I think that puts pressure, if you like, on parties like Sinn Féin, parties like the SDLP, to spell out in a bit more concrete detail what they mean as well. So I think, it's just reassuring and heartening to see that members of political parties themselves, including Sinn Féin, has just published a recent document on the economic benefits of United Ireland, beginning to think in a bit more detail about what all this means. And I think the more people that are involved in that discussion, the better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And speaking of Sinn Féin, we'll finish on a question about their friends in Stormont, the DUP. Obviously, at the time of recording this, Arlene Foster has announced that she'll step down as the leader of the DUP and as well the Deputy First Minister position. How do you think the United Ireland referendum, the Shared Island referendum, and the removal of the NI protocol will influence the next appointment of the next DUP leader?
I think it's a great question, but ultimately my view on this is that the leadership of the DUP doesn't change the facts on the ground.
Yeah.
in terms of what's happening. The agreement is there, the protocol is there, there's a commitment to implement both. The protocol is negotiated by the European Union and the UK, and I think there's a clear commitment there to implement the protocol. Ultimately, I think the new leader of the DUP faces the same challenges that the previous leader of the DUP also faced. So I think that doesn't change much about the facts on the ground. But, Jack, what's been really interesting in the last few days, and actually the last 24 hours, listening to commentators, is that, how many commentators are suggesting that this will be the DUP leader that leads unionism into a referendum campaign here, which I think is fascinating, and it maybe takes us back to the start of the discussion. I was listening this morning to the radio, and people were basically just assuming, the next leader of the DUP will be leading unionism into a referendum in Northern Ireland. And that, in a sense, is testament to the extent to which this conversation has now become a default mainstream discussion. And I suppose for the DUP as a political party, a factor that they need to think about is, how are they going to extend their electoral appeal? We've seen what's happened to unionism electorally over the last number of years. If unionism is going to maintain the union, the DUP, as part of that bigger political project, is going to think very hard about how it builds. Has to think very hard about how it builds a persuasive case to persuade a majority of people here to continue with the current arrangements. But the facts on the ground for unionism or for the DUP won't change with DUP leadership. And also worth bearing in mind, Jack, that there's a history here of people that were once regarded as formidable, formidable, the toughest in their political parties end up in the end being the ones who make the deal and implement things they're ostensibly opposed to,
Absolutely. Gosh, well, there were great questions, and thank you for answering those.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you. Thank you.
So really, really great. We're living in very interesting times, and we're witnessing a lot. But
Absolutely.
just finally, and I guess it's just nicely leading us into our final question here. This generation, us, our young people, have witnessed, and I suppose are witness to, seismic changes going on around here, happening socially, politically and historically. So we ask all of our guests in this show just to comment on the importance of activism in this era and what activism maybe means to you, Colin, and how you would encourage listeners who are interested in your area of work and more broadly matters of public law, human rights law, to pursue a career or engage, I suppose, in change to make things happen. What would your advice be to our listeners?
Well, first of all, I just want to take the opportunity in our discussion today to thank and commend all the civil society activists across the island who are the people who make change happen on the island. You might not hear their names, might not know who they are, but I'll tell you what, my life and career and my work has taught me that they are very often the people who are making change happen on the island of Ireland quietly every day of the week. So I just want to applaud them, people whose names you will never hear, who make a real difference. And that's ultimately, Sarah and Jack, what it's about. I got involved and I'm involved in the work I do because, it may sound naive, but, I want to change the world. You can make a difference. We may be in difficult times, but things can change. Things can change very quickly. And things change through people and activism and advocacy. So it's about making a difference. And ultimately, for me, for the younger generation, what an unbelievable project to be involved in. To be involved in a project of transforming this island for the better. Nobody wants a new Ireland to be, a place of poverty, inequality, and injustice where rights are denied. Want it to be absolutely fundamentally based on a very, very ambitious vision of equality and human rights. And you won't make that change happen if you don't get involved. So get involved, be part of something that will fundamentally change this island for the better and change people's lives. So the more people are on board with this, the better. And, you know, those are the people every day of the week who are quietly transforming the lives of people up and down this island. And I just want to commend them all.
Absolutely.
Today.
And hear to that from us. But fantastic advice for our listeners, Colin. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on to talk about all of those issues. And it's something that's live. It's something that we're all interested in. We all should be a part of because it involves us. So it's fantastic to have your perspective and your opinion. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Colin.
Thank you, Sarah and Jack. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.